I worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy family for 10 years. When the owner died, the lawyer read the will in front of the whole family. When it was read out, everyone turned to look at me. It turned out he had left me $43 million. But on one condition. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Carol Whitfield, and I was 61 years old when my life changed forever. Though on the morning it happened, I didn't know it yet. I had spent 10 years as a housekeeper for Mr. Edward Lassiter, a widower who lived alone in a sprawling colonial house on the outskirts of Greenwich, Connecticut. 10 years of dusting shelves lined with photographs of a family that rarely visited, of cooking meals that often went half-eaten because he ate alone, of listening to him talk about his late wife, Margaret, who had died before I ever started working there. Mr. Lassiter was not an easy man, but he was fair. He paid me well. He remembered my birthday, and in the last few years, as his health declined, I became more than a housekeeper. I drove him to doctor's appointments. I sat with him during long afternoons when his arthritis kept him from doing much else. I learned the names of his grandchildren, Tyler and Madison, even though I'd only met them a handful of times, usually at holidays when they showed up for an hour, smiled for photos, and left. His son, Richard, was a different story. Richard visited more often than the grandchildren, but never out of warmth. He came to talk about money, investments, the house, what his father planned to do with his assets, eventually. I overheard more of those conversations than Richard probably realized, since I was usually in the next room with a vacuum or a duster. Richard's wife, Diane, came along sometimes too, and she had a way of looking at the furniture, the artwork, the silver, cataloging it almost, that always made me uneasy. I never thought about Mr. Lassiter's money. That wasn't my business. I cleaned his house. I made sure he took his medication, and when he had a bad night, I was the one who sat with him until he fell back asleep. That was the job, and I did it because somewhere along the way I had grown to care about him. He died in March, on a Tuesday, in his sleep. The hospice nurse called me before she called Richard because she knew I'd want to be there. I sat with his body for almost an hour before anyone else arrived, and I cried. Not because I expected anything from him, but because for 10 years he had been a constant in my life, and now he wasn't. The funeral was small. Richard gave a eulogy that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd read about his father rather than known him. Diane wore black that looked more expensive than anything I owned. The grandchildren, now in their 20s, stood off to the side on their phones. 2 weeks later, Richard called me. "The lawyer wants everyone at the reading of the will," he said, "including you, Carol. Dad specifically named you." I remember standing in my kitchen, phone in hand, feeling my stomach drop. Named me? For what? I assumed it would be something small, maybe a piece of jewelry that belonged to Margaret, something sentimental. I told myself not to expect anything more than that, because expecting more would be foolish, and foolish people got hurt. The reading was held in the lawyer's office in downtown Greenwich, a wood-paneled room that smelled like old books and furniture polish. Richard sat at the head of the table with Diane beside him. Tyler and Madison sat across from them, both looking bored. I sat near the door, feeling like I didn't belong, which, in their eyes, I clearly didn't. The lawyer, a calm man named Mr. Adler, began reading. Small bequests first. Some money to a charity Mr. Lassiter had supported, a few personal items to the grandchildren, then the house, the investment accounts, the bulk of the estate, all going to Richard, as expected, and then Mr. Adler paused, adjusted his glasses, and said, "The remainder of the estate, valued at approximately $43 million, held in a trust established 8 months prior to Mr. Lassiter's death, is to be left in its entirety to Carol Whitfield." The room went silent. Every head turned toward me. Richard's face went pale, then red. Diane's mouth opened slightly, frozen mid-breath. I sat there, completely still, my ears ringing, certain I had misheard. "There is," Mr. Adler continued, "a condition." That word, condition, hung in the air like a held breath. I didn't know yet what it meant, but I knew in that moment, looking at the fury rising in Richard's eyes, that whatever came next would not be simple. Mr. Adler let the silence settle before he continued. "The condition," he said, looking at me over his glasses, "is that Ms. Whitfield must remain in the Lassiter residence for a period of no less than 12 months following Mr. Lassiter's death, during which time she will oversee the proper transition and inventory of the estate's assets. Should she vacate the premises before that period concludes, or should she be removed by any means other than her own free choice, the entire trust reverts to a designated secondary beneficiary." "And who," Richard said, his voice tight, "is the secondary beneficiary?" "You, Mr. Lassiter," Adler said simply. I felt the air change in the room. Richard's jaw clenched, and Diane's hand found his arm. Not for comfort, I realized, but as if to steady him, to keep him from saying something he'd regret in front of the lawyer. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small apartment in Stamford, the one I'd lived in for 15 years, and I tried to make sense of it. $43 million. The number didn't feel real. It felt like something that happened to other people, in other lives. I thought about my daughter, Emily, who was struggling to pay off her nursing school loans. I thought about my own retirement, which I hadn't been able to save much for, not on a housekeeper's wages. I thought about the modest life I'd built, brick by brick, for 61 years. And then I thought about Richard's face. I wasn't naive. I'd worked in that house long enough to know what kind of man Richard was. The kind who spoke to waitstaff like furniture, who'd once made his father's home health aide cry over a misplaced set of keys, who had, more than once, hinted to his father that people who do this kind of work couldn't really be trusted. He had never been cruel to me directly, but I had seen how he treated people he believed were beneath him, and I understood with a cold clarity that he would not simply accept this. Not for a year, maybe not ever. The next morning, I called Mr. Adler. "I need to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to," I told him, "and I need to understand what protections I have." He was patient with me. He explained that the will was airtight. Mr. Lassiter had been of sound mind when he drafted it. There were medical evaluations on file, and the trust had been established with the help of an estate planning attorney, not just scribbled in a hurry. "He was very deliberate about this, Carol," Adler said. "He wanted to make sure it would hold up." "Why me?" I asked. It was the question that had been eating at me all night. Adler was quiet for a moment. "He left a letter, addressed to you. I was instructed to give it to you privately, after the reading." That afternoon, I drove to his office and read the letter alone, sitting in my car in the parking lot afterward because I couldn't bring myself to read it in front of anyone. In his handwriting, shaky in his last months but still recognizable, he wrote that I was the only person who had treated him like a human being in the last decade of his life, rather than a wallet or an obligation. He wrote that he knew what Richard and Diane were like, that he'd watched them circle his assets for years like vultures waiting for him to finally die. He wrote that he didn't expect this to be easy for me and that he was sorry for that, but that he trusted me to handle it with the same steadiness I'd shown him every day for 10 years. I cried again, reading that letter. But underneath the grief, something else was forming. A recognition that I had a decision to make, and that decision would change everything. I could walk away, forfeit the inheritance, go back to my quiet life, avoid the conflict entirely. Part of me, the part that had spent 61 years trying not to make waves, wanted to do exactly that. But another part of me, a part I hadn't heard from in a long time, was angry. Angry on Mr. Lassiter's behalf for the family that had circled him like vultures while he was still breathing, and angry for myself, too, because I had earned this in every way that mattered except blood. I decided to stay, not for the money alone, though I won't pretend the money didn't matter. I decided to stay because Edward Lassiter had trusted me with something, and I wasn't going to let Richard bully me out of honoring that trust. My first step was small but important. I called my daughter Emily and asked her to come stay with me at the house. Not as a bodyguard exactly. But I didn't want to be alone in that place, not with what I now knew was coming. Emily, God bless her, didn't hesitate. She took 2 weeks off from the hospital where she worked and packed a bag that same night. My second step was to call a lawyer of my own. Adler represented the estate, not me personally. I understood that much, at least. I needed someone whose only job was to protect my interests. A co-worker's sister, it turned out, knew an attorney named Patricia Nguyen who specialized in estate disputes. I made an appointment for that Friday. I moved into the Lassiter house 3 days after the reading of the will. Richard wasn't there when I arrived. Adler had arranged for the formal transfer of keys and access, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he showed up. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier. I walked through the rooms I'd cleaned for 10 years, looking at them with new eyes, knowing that for the next 12 months, this was my home and my battle to win. The first official step was the inventory. Patricia Nguyen, my new attorney, was sharp and no nonsense, the kind of woman who didn't waste words. In our first meeting, she laid it out plainly. The will requires you to oversee proper transition and inventory of the estate's assets. That's not just a formality, Carol. That's your shield. As long as you're doing that job faithfully and documented, Richard has no legal grounds to remove you, but he'll look for any excuse he can find. So we made it official. Within a week, a court-appointed estate appraiser, a woman named Linda Park, recommended by Adler, began the process of cataloging everything in the house: the furniture, the artwork, Margaret's jewelry collection, the silver, the wine cellar, even the contents of the garage, which included a vintage Jaguar that Mr. Lassiter hadn't driven in 15 years. I worked alongside Linda for hours each day, room by room, item by item, photographing and documenting everything. It was tedious work, but it gave me purpose, and more importantly, it gave me a paper trail. Proof that I was fulfilling the condition of the will exactly as written. It was during this process, in the 3rd week, that Richard started showing up unannounced. The first time, he claimed he'd left some personal documents in his father's study and needed to retrieve them. Linda, professional as ever, told him that nothing could be removed from the house without being logged and approved, given the ongoing inventory. Richard's smile was thin. "Of course," he said. "I understand. Wouldn't want anything to go missing." The implication wasn't subtle. He was suggesting, even then, that I couldn't be trusted around the family's belongings. laying groundwork, I realized later, for something bigger. The second visit, 2 days after that, Diane came along. She was sweeter than Richard, in a way that felt more calculated, not less. She walked through the house commenting on how well-kept everything looked, how lovely it was that I'd taken such good care of Edward's things over the years. Each compliment landed like a small barb, a reminder that, in her eyes, I was still the help, regardless of what the will said. That evening, after they left, Emily found me sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "You okay, Mom?" "They're going to come at this from every angle," I said. "I can feel it." She sat down across from me. "Then we make sure every angle is covered." It was Emily, actually, who suggested the security cameras. If they're going to claim you mishandled something, or took something, or did anything wrong, you need proof of what actually happens in this house, for your protection. I installed cameras in the common areas, the entryway, the living room, the study, the kitchen, not in private spaces, nothing invasive, but enough to document anyone who came and went, and what happened while they were there. Patricia approved of the move immediately. "Smart," she said. "Document everything. If they're building a case against you, you need to be building your own case in parallel." The point of no return came in the 5th week. I was going through Mr. Lassiter's study with Linda, cataloging the contents of his desk, when I found a locked drawer that hadn't been on the original list of keys Adler had given me. I mentioned it to Linda, who noted it for the inventory, and we located a locksmith to open it properly. Everything documented, everything by the book. Inside, among old tax documents and correspondence, was a folder labeled simply R. It contained bank statements, not Mr. Lassiter's personal accounts, but records of transfers from an account that, according to the documents, Richard had set up using power of attorney privileges his father had granted him 2 years earlier, when Mr. Lassiter's health first began to decline. The transfers were small at first, a few $1,000s here and there, but they grew larger over time and more frequent. Over 2 years, nearly $380,000 had moved from Mr. Lassiter's accounts into accounts associated with Richard and Diane. There was also a handwritten note in Mr. Lassiter's shaky script, dated about 10 months before his death, around the time he'd established the trust that left everything to me. The note read, "Found the transfers. R denies it. Says it's reimbursement for managing my affairs. I never agreed to this. Need to speak with Adler about revoking the POA. Trust no longer safe with him." I sat there holding that note, my hands trembling slightly, and I understood, finally, why Edward Lassiter had done what he did. He hadn't just been rewarding me. He'd been protecting his estate from his own son. Linda, watching my face, asked gently if everything was all right. I told her I needed to call my attorney immediately, and I did, right there in the study, my voice steadier than I expected. "Patricia," I said, "I think I just found something that changes everything." Patricia came to the house that same evening. She read through the documents twice, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is significant, Carol. If these transfers happened without proper authorization or beyond the scope of the power of attorney, this could be financial elder abuse. That's a criminal matter, not just a civil one." "What do I do with it?" "We document it properly, we make copies, and we report it. To Adler first, since he's the estate's attorney and needs to know, and potentially to the state's Office of Elder Protective Services, depending on what we find when we dig deeper into the timeline of that power of attorney." We spent the next several days building the case carefully. Patricia brought in a forensic accountant, a methodical man named Howard Greer, who began tracing every transfer, cross-referencing dates with medical records that showed Mr. Lassiter's cognitive state at the time each transfer was made. The picture that emerged was damning. Many of the larger transfers had occurred during periods when Mr. Lassiter's medical records noted mild cognitive impairment and periods of confusion, meaning Richard had potentially exploited his father's diminished capacity. I knew, the moment we filed the report with Adler, that the war was no longer quiet. Richard found out within days. I suspected Adler's office, or perhaps Linda's team, had to formally notify him as part of the estate proceedings, since the discovery affected the overall value and distribution of assets. Whatever the source, Richard knew, and Richard was furious. He showed up at the house on a Thursday evening, no warning, pounding on the front door hard enough that Emily and I both jumped. When I opened it, his face was red, his voice shaking with rage he wasn't even trying to hide. "You think you can just go digging through private family records and start accusing people?" he shouted. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you understand who you're dealing with?" "Richard, I think you should leave," I said, keeping my voice level, though my heart was pounding. "This is my family's business. My father's estate. You're a housekeeper, Carol, a maid, and you think some piece of paper gives you the right to—" "The piece of paper," I said, cutting him off, "is a legally valid will, drawn up by an attorney, with medical documentation supporting your father's competence at the time he wrote it. And the other piece of paper is a forensic accounting report showing nearly $400,000 moved out of his accounts while he was, according to his own doctors, struggling with cognitive decline. I didn't go looking for that, Richard. I found it because I was doing exactly what the will required me to do." His face went through several colors. For a moment, I genuinely thought he might come at me. Emily later told me she'd had her phone in her hand, ready to call 911 the entire time. But instead, Richard took a step back, breathing hard, and pointed a finger at me. "You'll regret this," he said. "I will make the next 12 months of your life a living hell. You'll be begging to walk away from this house, and when you do, every penny goes back where it belongs." He left. I locked the door behind him, and then I sat down on the floor of the entryway because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. The threats didn't stop there. Over the following 2 weeks, I received anonymous complaints filed against me. One claiming I damaged a piece of antique furniture during the inventory. The security cameras proved otherwise. Another claiming I'd been harassing Richard's family with unwanted contact, also disproven by phone records, since I'd made no calls to him at all. Each complaint was investigated and dismissed, but each one cost time, stress, and money in legal fees. Then came the lawsuit. Richard, through his attorneys, filed a motion to have me removed as a fiduciary of the estate's transition process, claiming I was unqualified and potentially compromised given my personal financial interest in the outcome, as though the conflict of interest wasn't entirely his own. Patricia fought it, methodically and without panic. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the judge ruled that I could remain in the house per the original terms of the will while the matter was reviewed. It was, Patricia said, a small victory, but an important one. Richard had tried to use the courts as a weapon, and for now, it hadn't worked. After the hearing date was set, I told Emily I needed a few days. Just a few days to breathe, to not think about lawyers and inventories and forensic accountants. She understood completely. "Go," she said. "I'll hold down the fort. You've earned a break." I spent those days quietly. Long walks through the property's gardens, which Margaret had apparently designed decades ago, evenings reading in the sunroom, simple meals that I cooked just for myself, the way I used to before all of this began. It wasn't escape exactly. It was recalibration. I needed to remember who I was outside of this fight, so I'd have the strength to keep fighting it. The attempt to tempt me came about 10 days after Richard's outburst, and it didn't come from Richard at all. It came from Diane. She called me directly, a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, curious. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Carol, I know things have gotten ugly. I want you to know I don't agree with how Richard's been handling this. I think there's a way we can resolve this that works for everyone." She proposed a meeting, not at the house, somewhere neutral, a quiet restaurant in Greenwich. "Just the two of us," she said, "woman to woman." I told Patricia about the call before I responded. Patricia's advice was simple. If you go, I go too, or at minimum, you record it. Legally, in Connecticut, you can record a conversation you're a party to. And don't agree to anything verbally. Anything real gets put in writing, reviewed by me. I agreed to the meeting, with those conditions in mind. The night before, I found myself oddly nervous, more nervous than I'd been before the hearing dates were even set. There was something about facing Diane alone, away from lawyers and documents, that felt different. Emily noticed and asked if I wanted her to come along, wait outside, anything. I told her no. If Diane wanted woman to woman, I'd give her exactly that and let the recording do the rest. I drove to the restaurant early, sat in the car for a few minutes beforehand, checking the small recorder Patricia had given me, going over in my head what I would and wouldn't say. I kept thinking about how strange it was, that after 10 years of being the one who served coffee, who refilled water glasses, who stayed quiet in rooms where important conversations happened around me, I was now the one being courted, the one whose answer mattered. Diane arrived looking polished, warm, every inch the gracious hostess even in a public restaurant. She ordered a glass of wine, asked about Emily, asked how I was holding up through all this stress, as if the stress were some unfortunate weather system rather than something her husband had directly caused. Then she made her offer. "Richard and I have talked," she said, leaning in slightly, "and we think there's a number that could make this easier for everyone." "What if you walked away?" "Not with nothing, Carol. That wouldn't be fair after everything you've done for Edward. But with, say, $2 million, clean. No lawyers, no court battles, no more stress. You take the money, you live comfortably for the rest of your life, and the rest goes back to the family, where it makes sense for it to go. $2 million. It was, I'll admit, more money than I had ever imagined having in my life before all of this began. A few months earlier, I would have thought $2 million was an impossible fortune. For one brief, dizzying moment, I let myself imagine it, a quiet condo, somewhere warm, no lawyers, no Richard, no more anonymous complaints. It would have been so easy to just say yes. But I sat there, looking at Diane's carefully composed face, and I thought about Edward Lassiter's letter. I thought about the note in his shaky handwriting, trust no longer safe with him. I thought about the forensic accounting report, the $380,000 already taken, the medical records showing his confusion while it happened. "Diane," I said calmly, "Edward left me $43 million because he didn't trust Richard with it. He documented why. If I take $2 million and walk away quietly, I'm not just giving up money. I'm helping Richard cover up what he did to his own father. I won't do that." Diane's expression flickered. Just for a second, the warmth dropped, and something colder showed through. Then she recovered, smiled tightly, and said, "I think you're making a mistake, Carol. A big one." "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to make." She left shortly after, and I sat there finishing my coffee, my hands steady, my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. I drove home slowly that evening, taking the longer route along the water, just to have a few extra minutes to myself before walking back into the house and everything waiting there. I remember rolling the window down despite the cold, just to feel the air on my face, to remind myself I was still the same person I'd been that morning. Only now, I understood something about myself I hadn't before. When I told Patricia about the offer, she nodded slowly. That confirms something for us. They're worried. People who are confident in their legal position don't offer $2 million to make a problem go away. They offer that when they're afraid of what a court might find. In the weeks that followed, I found something I hadn't expected: support from people I'd least anticipated. Linda Park, the estate appraiser who had spent so many hours working alongside me, quietly mentioned that she'd seen this kind of thing before: families pressuring vulnerable heirs, and that she'd be willing to testify, if needed, about my conduct throughout the inventory process. Howard Greer, the forensic accountant, offered the same. And then there was Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Lassiter's longtime gardener, who had worked on the property even longer than I had. She came by one afternoon, unprompted, just to talk. She told me stories about Edward Lassiter I'd never heard, how he used to sit on the back porch and complain quietly about how his son only called when he needed something. She told me she'd always suspected something wasn't right with Richard's visits, the way he'd ask about the accounts more than he asked about his father's health. "He trusted you," Mrs. Alvarez said simply. "Anyone could see that. I'm glad someone's finally standing up for him, even now." It wasn't a courtroom victory. It wasn't even close to over. But for the first time since the will had been read, I didn't feel alone in this house. I felt like I had people around me who believed I was doing the right thing, and that mattered more than I expected it to. The hearing was 3 weeks away when Richard and Diane came back to the house, together this time, and with an entirely different approach. They called ahead, which was new. Richard's voice on the phone was subdued, almost contrite. "Carol, I've been thinking a lot since that night. I said things I shouldn't have. Diane and I would like to come by if that's all right. We'd like to try to clear the air. For Dad's sake, if nothing else." I almost said no. Every instinct told me this was a trap of some kind, but Patricia, when I told her, said, "Let them come. Keep the cameras running, as always. Sometimes people reveal more when they think they're being conciliatory than when they're being aggressive." I spent the morning before their visit walking through the house, trying to steady myself. Emily offered to stay close by in the upstairs hallway, just out of view but within earshot if anything went wrong. I told her that was probably a good idea, not because I expected violence, but because I didn't trust my own composure if things turned ugly again, and having her there reminded me I wasn't facing this alone. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, both dressed more casually than usual, both wearing expressions of careful humility. Richard apologized, a long, rehearsed-sounding apology about grief and stress, and saying things he didn't mean. Diane added her own remarks about how this whole situation has been hard on everyone, and how she just wanted the family to heal. For the first 20 minutes, I almost let myself believe it was genuine. They asked about the house, about whether I'd kept Margaret's roses alive, Small, almost tender questions that, for a moment, made the last several months feel like they could simply be set aside, forgotten, the way families sometimes pretend difficult things never happened at all. Then Richard shifted the conversation, gently toward the upcoming hearing. You know, Carol, even if you win this, even if the judge sides with you completely, is it really worth it? The stress, the legal fees, the toll this is taking on you? You've worked hard your whole life. Wouldn't it feel good to just be at peace? We could find a number that feels right, not like before. A real number. Generous. Something that lets everyone move forward. There it was, the mask slipping just slightly. And the forensic report? I asked. The transfers? What happens to that in this scenario where everyone moves forward? Diane's smile tightened. Carol, that report, it's complicated. Edward authorized Richard to manage things. Family helps family. It's not as simple as some accountant's spreadsheet makes it look. It looked pretty simple to Edward, I said quietly. He wrote it down himself, in his own handwriting. Trust no longer safe with him. That's not complicated, Diane. That's about as clear as it gets. Richard's composure cracked, just slightly. You don't know what you're talking about. You worked here 10 years cleaning toilets, and suddenly you think you understand this family better than I do? I think, I said, standing up, that I understand exactly what kind of man your father was, because I spent every day with him for 10 years, while you spent maybe 10 days a year with him, mostly asking about money. And I think you should leave now, because this conversation is over. Diane stood quickly, her hand on Richard's arm again. But this time it wasn't to steady him for appearances. It was urgency. Richard, let's go. He stood, his face a mixture of fury and something else. Fear, maybe. The first real fear I'd seen from him. At the door, he turned back one more time. You're going to lose everything, Carol. Everything. Mark my words. After they left, I stood in the entryway for a long moment, my heart pounding, my hands shaking slightly. Not from doubt, but from adrenaline. Emily came down from upstairs where she'd been listening the whole time, just out of sight. Mom, she said, you were incredible. I didn't feel incredible. I felt scared, genuinely scared for the first time in weeks. Richard's last words had a weight to them, a certainty, as though he knew something I didn't. I tried to think through every possibility. What leverage could he still have? What move could be left to him? But nothing made sense, and the not knowing was almost worse than a clear threat would have been. But that fear didn't make me doubt my decision. If anything, it sharpened it. I called Patricia that evening and told her everything, word for word, while the recording was still fresh. This is good, Carol, Patricia said, after listening to the recording I'd made. This is very good. He just admitted on tape that he managed his father's accounts, and Diane all but confirmed she knew about it and considers it normal. Combined with the forensic report and the medical records, this strengthens our position substantially heading into the hearing. That night, lying awake, I thought about what Richard had said. You're going to lose everything. I didn't know what he meant by it, but I knew, with 3 weeks until the hearing, that whatever he was planning, it was coming soon. The hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning in a Stamford courthouse, in a room far less elegant than Adler's office had been. Fluorescent lights, worn carpet, the low hum of an old HVAC system. I arrived early with Emily and Patricia and sat in the hallway outside the courtroom for nearly 20 minutes before doors opened. Richard and Diane arrived separately from Coleman, not speaking to each other, both staring straight ahead. A small detail, but one that struck me even then. Whatever united front they'd tried to present at the house weeks earlier seemed to have already worn thin. Patricia spent those 20 minutes going over the order of witnesses one more time, calmly, the way she'd done every day that week. "Don't react to anything Coleman says about your character," she reminded me. "He's going to try to paint a picture. Let the documents argue for you." I nodded, though my stomach was in knots. Emily squeezed my hand once, briefly, and didn't let go until the bailiff called us in. Richard's attorney, a sharp-suited man named Coleman, opened with the argument that I was unqualified to oversee the estate transition, citing my lack of financial expertise and suggesting that my personal stake in the outcome made me an inappropriate fiduciary. He painted a picture of an elderly man, vulnerable and isolated, manipulated in his final months by a caregiver who saw an opportunity. I sat there, hands folded, feeling the old instinct rise up, the instinct to shrink, to apologize, to not make waves. I pushed it down. Patricia had told me the night before not to react to anything Coleman said, no matter how it was framed. Let the document speak. That's what wins this. I held on to that. Patricia's response was methodical. She called Linda Park first, who testified to the meticulous, professional way I'd conducted the inventory process. Nothing missing, nothing mishandled, every item documented to the letter. Then Howard Greer took the stand, walking the court through the forensic accounting report, the $380,000 in transfers, the timeline overlapping with documented periods of Mr. Lassiter's cognitive decline, the power of attorney that had been used, Greer's word, expansively, beyond what would typically be considered standard management of an elderly parent's affairs. Coleman cross-examined Greer for nearly 20 minutes, trying to introduce doubt about the timeline, suggesting Mr. Lassiter's confusion might have been exaggerated in the medical records. But Greer held firm, calmly walking through each date, each diagnosis, each transfer, until even Coleman seemed to lose confidence in the line of questioning. At one point, Judge Whitcomb herself asked Greer a clarifying question about one of the larger transfers, and the precision of his answer, down to the exact date and the doctor's note from that same week, seemed to land heavily in the room. I noticed Coleman glance briefly toward Richard, as though gauging whether to continue down that path at all before moving on. Then came the recording. Patricia played it for the court. Richard's voice, clear and unmistakable, suggesting a financial settlement to make the forensic report go away, and Diane's casual admission that the transfers were simply how family helps family. Coleman objected, arguing the recording was inadmissible, but the judge, a measured woman named Judge Whitcomb, noted that Connecticut law permitted one-party consent recordings and allowed it into evidence. I watched Richard's face as the recording played. I watched the color drain from it, watched Diane stare fixedly at the table in front of her, watch Coleman's jaw tighten as his case began to unravel in real time. Somewhere behind me, I heard Emily exhale, slowly, like she'd been holding her breath the entire time. Then Mr. Adler took the stand, and this was the moment I hadn't fully anticipated. Adler testified that, in the months before his death, Mr. Lassiter had contacted him directly, multiple times, expressing concern about the transfers from his accounts. Adler confirmed that Mr. Lassiter had been in the process of formally revoking Richard's power of attorney when he died. The paperwork had been drafted, but not yet executed, because Mr. Lassiter's health declined too quickly. He was afraid, Adler told the court. his voice steady but grave, that if he confronted his son directly, Richard would find some way to isolate him, limit his access to his own accounts, perhaps even challenge his competency to manage his own affairs, which would have given Richard even more control. He felt his only protection was to ensure someone he trusted absolutely would be involved in the transition of his estate. Someone Richard couldn't intimidate or manipulate the way he could intimidate his own father. The courtroom was silent. I felt tears in my eyes, not from sadness exactly, but from something like vindication. Finally, someone besides me understood what Edward Lassiter had been trying to do and why. I glanced at Richard, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the weight of everything being said was physically pressing down on him. Coleman tried to recover, attempting to argue that even if the transfers were questionable, that didn't disqualify me from my role as fiduciary, that the two issues were separate matters. But Judge Whitcomb had clearly made up her mind. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "your client is asking this court to remove the one person in this estate who has, by every measure presented today, acted with diligence, transparency, and integrity, in order to restore control to a man who is currently under investigation by this state's Office of Elder Protective Services for potential financial exploitation of his own father. I think the irony of that request speaks for itself." Richard's face in that moment was a portrait of a man watching everything slip away. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like panic. Judge Whitcomb's ruling was unambiguous. The motion to remove me as fiduciary was denied in full. The judge further ordered that, given the evidence presented regarding the unauthorized transfers, the matter would be formally referred to the Office of Elder Protective Services and potentially to the state's attorney's office for criminal review. Financial exploitation of an elderly person being a felony offense in Connecticut when the amounts involved exceeded certain thresholds, which $380,000 certainly did. Richard's attorney requested a brief recess, presumably to discuss damage control with his client. When the hearing resumed, Coleman, looking considerably less confident, informed the court that Richard wished to avoid further litigation and would not contest the will's terms going forward, an attempt, transparent to everyone in the room, to head off criminal referral by appearing cooperative. It didn't fully work. The criminal investigation proceeded regardless. Judge Whitcomb's referral wasn't something Richard's cooperation in the civil matter could simply erase. Over the following months, the Office of Elder Protective Services, working with the state's attorney, built a case against Richard for financial exploitation of an elderly person. Investigators interviewed Linda, Howard, and even Mrs. Alvarez, piecing together a picture of a man who had, slowly and methodically, treated his father's accounts as an extension of his own for years, while presenting himself publicly as a dutiful son managing things for Dad's own good. Patricia kept me updated through most of it, though she was careful to remind me more than once that the criminal process wasn't mine to control or even really to participate in beyond providing documentation. "Your part is done, Carol," she told me one afternoon. "Now it's just the system doing what it does, slowly." That was hard to sit with, honestly. After everything, I wanted some kind of immediate reckoning, and instead what I got was months of waiting, occasional phone calls, paperwork arriving in the mail with case numbers I didn't fully understand. Diane, it turned out, had her own accounts that had received some of those transferred funds, and she found herself named as well, though to a lesser degree. According to Patricia, who kept me informed throughout, Diane's attorney spent considerable effort trying to separate her from Richard's actions, arguing she'd had no direct knowledge, an argument undercut somewhat by her own words on the recording from that Sunday afternoon. I won't pretend there was some dramatic perp walk, handcuffs in a courtroom, anything like the movies. The reality was slower, grayer, more bureaucratic, but no less final. Richard eventually pleaded to a reduced charge, avoiding a trial, but the plea still meant a felony conviction, a court-ordered restitution of the $380,000, plus interest, back to the estate, which, since the residual estate was mine, meant back to me, and a probationary sentence that included community service and financial monitoring. Diane was never charged criminally, but in a separate civil matter, the estate, meaning, again, me through Patricia, successfully recovered the portion of the transferred funds that had ended up in her accounts. I remember the day the restitution finally came through, a letter from Patricia's office, almost anticlimactic in how plain it looked, just numbers on a page. I sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. It didn't feel like triumph, exactly. It felt more like something had finally, quietly, been set right. The kind of feeling that doesn't need an audience to matter. I want to be honest. There was no moment of Richard breaking down in tears, admitting wrongdoing, asking for forgiveness. People like Richard rarely do that. What I got instead was something quieter, but, in its way, more satisfying. A complete and total loss of the position he'd assumed was his birthright. The house, Edward Lassiter's house, where I had worked for 10 years and where I'd now lived for nearly a year, remained mine, per the original will, once the 12-month condition was satisfied. The remainder of the $43 million estate, now slightly larger thanks to the restitution, was entirely mine, with no further legal challenges possible. Richard and Diane moved out of state within the year. Coleman mentioned, during one of the final proceedings, that they'd relocated to Arizona, where Richard had some distant family. I never heard from either of them again, not directly. The grandchildren, Tyler and Madison, sent me a brief, somewhat awkward card a few months later. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement, I think, that they'd seen enough of the proceedings to understand their father hadn't been the victim he'd claimed to be. The 12 months passed eventually, the way all difficult years eventually do, slowly, then suddenly, all at once. I stayed in the Lassiter house, though I made it my own, gradually. I repainted some of the rooms that had felt too formal, too much like a museum. I kept Margaret's garden, which Mrs. Alvarez and I tended together, and which became, over time, one of my favorite places in the world. There was a particular bench near the rose beds where I started having my morning coffee, and some mornings I'd sit there and just listen to the quiet, still half expecting, out of old habit, to hear Mr. Lassiter's voice calling from the study, asking what was for breakfast. Emily moved closer. Not into the house. She had her own life, and I wanted her to keep it, but into a place nearby, close enough that we saw each other often. With the financial security the inheritance provided, she was able to finish her nursing degree without the crushing weight of loan debt, and eventually opened a small private practice with 2 colleagues, something she'd dreamed about for years but never thought possible. I went to the ribbon cutting for that practice and cried more than I expected to, watching her cut that little ceremonial ribbon, thinking about how different her path might have looked otherwise. I didn't become a different person, not really. I still got up early. I still found myself, occasionally, reaching for a duster before catching myself and laughing a little at the habit. but I also did things I'd never imagined. I traveled, for the first time in my life, to places I'd only seen in magazines. I stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon and cried for an entirely different reason, just from the sheer size of it. The feeling of the world being so much bigger than the small, careful life I'd lived for 61 years. I set up a scholarship fund in Edward Lassiter's name for young people pursuing careers in caregiving and nursing. People who did the kind of work that so often goes unseen and underappreciated, the kind of work I'd done for decades. Mrs. Alvarez stayed on as the property's gardener, now with a significant raise and full benefits, something Mr. Lassiter, despite his wealth, had never quite gotten around to providing. Linda Park and I stayed in touch. She'd later tell me that my case had become something of a quiet legend in her professional circles, a story about what could happen when someone did their job honestly, even under pressure. As for Richard and Diane, I heard secondhand through Adler that things hadn't gone smoothly for them in Arizona. The felony conviction made certain things difficult: professional licenses, financial transactions, even some housing applications. Diane, I heard, had grown bitter and isolated, blaming everyone, Richard, the lawyers, even Edward's memory, for what had happened, never quite able to see her own role in it. Their relationship, under the strain of all of it, reportedly grew distant. I felt, when I heard these things, not satisfaction exactly, more like the quiet recognition that consequences, when they finally arrive, tend to arrive in full, whether or not anyone's there to applaud them. I often thought about Edward, especially in the garden, in the evenings. I thought about how alone he must have felt in those final months, suspecting his own son but unable to fully act on it. How much courage it must have taken him to write that letter, to set up that trust, to put his trust, quite literally, in someone the rest of his family considered invisible. What would you have done in his position? Trusted blood even when blood had shown you exactly who they were? Or trusted the person who'd actually been there every single day for 10 years? Looking back now, I understand that this story was never really about money. It was about being seen, about someone in his final months finally recognizing who had truly been present in his life and who hadn't. The lesson I carry with me is this: integrity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's shown in the small, unglamorous moments, showing up, telling the truth, doing the right thing even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. That's what Edward saw in me, and in the end, it's what protected me too. So I'll leave you with the same question I've asked myself so many times.